point to that and say there's climate change. So that's what I'm saying, that there has to be this, I guess, compounded environment of crises after crises before humans respond. And but we will respond, as humans always do, in terms of the broad sweep of history. And as we do, the carbon market and some of the groundbreaking kind of initiatives that we'll hear about today and that we've heard about over the last weeks, you know, that's where these things will really hit stride and become very important. So what does the forest do with carbon, and what does it mean for markets? Well, there are approximately 32 billion tons of carbon emissions every year from industrial processes, and the two main sources for emissions are fossil fuel usage and the generation and creation of cement. As stated, to deal with this scale of emissions, the two main sinks that are being observed that are sequestering carbon are oceans and forests right now. All the human kind of technological stuff is it's unproven and it's just emerging, and I'm not saying that some of it does sequester carbon. It's just that in terms of dealing with the issue on a global scale, you have to have scalability. And in terms of the forest, in terms of humans being able to control and work with and modify a carbon sequestration forest, really forest sequestration is the only tool that's scalable, that's empirically confirmed today. If you grow a tree, it will sequester carbon, and you'll be able to model that over the long term. So again, the specifics may vary a little bit, and there may be academic arguments about what is more effective, what are the methods, but these are the two dominant observed carbon sinks, and of the two, forests, again, will be what humans use increasingly to sequester carbon as we go forward. The carbon load that we're talking about, if you took this 32 billion tons of carbon dioxide, you took out all the gaseous components and just took the carbon out, this is what the carbon mountain every year that we're putting into the atmosphere would look like. This is actually a little bit smaller than the actual emissions right now. This was a timber carbon, and this is the translation here. This is a timber carbon mountain. It's about 27 billion tons. So the figure that I had quoted earlier of 32 billion tons, the actual amount of emissions has grown since this timber pyramid was produced, actually by Google for some environmental NGOs that are monitoring the issue. So in terms of scale then, and in terms of what the voices from the field are doing, I think it's necessary to kind of take a look at the size of the problem, which is an annual mountain here. You can see this is a big issue, and if we look at a little skyscraper here, the Empire State Building, you can see this has to scale up. So there's a number of reasons why scale is important, but First Nations, in terms of specific examples, are jumping into this fray and actually producing some fairly significant examples. The two major examples that we're aware of that have a scalable and appreciable scale and are delivering some significant movement are the Great Bear Rainforest on the west coast, and then to the east, the Pimatuan Aki. And as you can see, the commonalities between the two initiatives are they're several million hectares in size. You have consortiums of First Nations that are pulling together and working with an ecological service area. And in terms of the Great Bear Rainforest, they have taken this idea and they have converted it into a number of different vehicles for First Nations development through the Coast Opportunity Group, which is, I guess, it's powered by a $130 million endowment. But one of the really neat things that they have also done out of this is they are generating and are marketing 30 million carbon credits over 30 years. Now, the Pimatuan Aki is acting on a similar scale and have taken a similar approach to the ecological services, And in terms of an endowment, they're going for a similar kind of structural organizational, I guess, support system. But they haven't made that jump yet, as we are aware, into generating carbon credits. But we include the example here to show that there's some basic structural considerations, I think, for groups if they're going to consider moving into the generation of carbon credits, that there's some examples there that they can pull from. In terms of individual nations, there are a lot of different individual nations who are actually designing and implementing and financing and moving forward with the individual carbon project. One of the most visible in Canada right now is the Munsee Delaware Nations Tree Corporation. And as you can see, because it's a single nation, acting mainly by itself, I mean, for the educational end of things, they are partnering with a couple of other different nations. But you can see the difference between an individual nation striking out and developing their own carbon initiative. You can still pull together a necessary amount of resources, pull in some training opportunities for the nation, for the people, and then develop under whatever market the nation is looking at in terms of marketing their carbon. There are markets out there. So in the Munsee Delaware case, the actual market that they have went to is the voluntary market, and they have secured a buyer over the counter, which is the Toronto Dominion Bank, as a part of their carbon neutrality corporate social responsibility policy. So there's many different ways right now to kind of skin this cat, and whether you are looking at in terms of an individual approach, you'll have to mix and match, and several of the speakers to date have spoken about the various detailed specifics that you would have to consider to do your individual approach, or you can go with the regional approach and kind of scale up. There's all points in between, of course, between these examples that are being pursued. And really what they're pointing to, and carbon and the development and what some of the nations that we've spoke to when they're working with this stuff is, many of them are seeing this convergence on the forest, additional demands on the forest. And because the forest is home to ecological services, and ecological service markets such as carbon trading are coming on board and growing in strength every year, we're seeing that this land demand already is producing pressure on nations to respond in some fashion. Now, in terms of some specific pressures that are coming out of this milieu, I'd say the major pressure that we're noticing on the national stage is the conservation initiative, and this is where large tracts of land are identified and are scoped for ecological services, and then some form of protection mandate is being sought either by other rival, I guess, First Nations, or even outside groups such as NGOs or the provincial and federal governments. You have your pick in terms of conservation and protection initiatives, and I think to not, I guess, pay attention to this in terms of one of the outcomes of carbon trading, we would be remiss. So that's, from our perspective, some of the major pressures that are pushing and pulling carbon trading onto your lands if you're a First Nation. In terms of the forest, again, as a specific venue then, where you would assume that these pressures would kind of meet would be in the forest tenure reform area, where the carbon is sequestered, where these projects take place. And at present, in the 4 major tenure reform areas in Canada of BC, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, there hasn't been any mention of carbon rights, carbon trading, carbon mechanisms in regards to First Nations or in regards to the tenure at all. So this is really kind of a lurking kind of issue that is there. It's central to forest tenure in the modern context. And from what we can see, Most nations in the future will probably want to be mixing a bit of ecological services and carbon trading in addition to traditional forestry activity on their land.